Most people think the genius of Howard Shore was amazing melodies, but I don't think it was. I think the true superpower of somebody like Howard Shore was making every scene sound like it belonged to a civilization. The music you're hearing right now isn't from The Lord of the Rings. This is something I wrote, but every note was built using the same principles that Shore used to make Middle-earth feel ancient, believable, and alive. So today, instead of breaking down one of Shore's cues, I'm going to actually show you the breakdown of one of my own cues using the system behind this sound. That way, at the end of the video, you'll be able to take these systems and techniques into your own cues and build your own musical worlds. If you've ever watched The Lord of the Rings and you wonder why Rohan feels different than Gondor or the Shire feels different than Mordor, that wasn't an accident. Howard Shore wasn't just writing themes, he was building cultures. Every instrument, every chord progression, every variation of a melody was meant to tell you something different about the people, the places, the culture. Today I wrote a short orchestral cue using 4 of Howard Shore's most powerful techniques. Those 4 techniques are theme as an identity, instrumentation as a culture, modal harmony, and theme transformation. One of the biggest misconceptions about film scoring is that theme is just a catchy melody. For sure, a theme is much more than that. It's identity, it's musical DNA. So if you listen to the beginning of my cue, you kind of notice where we start to form a musical identity or that theme with the horns. The melody begins with a rising perfect fourth. It slowly descends, and that shape is important. That upward leap feels noble and heroic. So that perfect fourth movement or that fourth up is going to give that feeling of mobility. The downward movement creates a longing and reflection. So we've got our perfect fourth here, and then our downward descent. It's the same basic emotional architecture that Shore uses throughout many of his most famous themes. His melodies often rise boldly and then descend lyrically. So this is a pretty common trait of Shore's writing, almost like a character looking forward towards the future and then kind of reflecting on the past. So what's important here isn't the exact notes, it's the emotional shape. That's something that a lot of composers miss when they're doing this style of writing. So when you're thinking about something like this, you want to copy the purpose. Ask yourself, what does this theme represent? Is it a person? Is it a culture? Is it a kingdom or a journey? Because once you know what the theme represents, every musical decision becomes a little bit easier. Also, one thing I would say when you're writing for brass, Shore wrote for real instruments, real orchestras. So you want to think about things like, notice we've got some space for some breath throughout our horn melody. We're not trying to just kill the French horn players with the melody and give them just an endless melody that they can't really perform. So you also want to make it sound realistic. So the next part is instrumentation as a culture. This is where Shore really becomes kind of genius in this area. So composers choose instruments a lot of times because they sound cool or they think that this texture works against that texture. But I think Shore really kind of chooses these instruments because they tell stories. So let's kind of break it down and take a look at the orchestra here. So as we notice, obviously our main theme is played by French horns. Why? It's because, horns naturally evoke heroicism, nobility, and distance. Historically, they're associated with like hunting calls and signals across landscapes. So before the audience even understands the melody, they hear that sound and that texture, and they really understand the emotion. So let's just take our horn, and then we're going to add in the strings. Notice what happened here. The melody didn't change, the feeling changed. So when we introduced our strings, it gave it a different feeling. The strings become the emotional engine. They're carrying the warmth, the movement, and depth underneath that theme. So let's add in our woodwinds. Woodwinds back in. Our flutes add, a shimmer and atmosphere. The oboe kind of adds a sense of, memory and longing. And the clarinets and bassoons kind of fill the gaps that make the orchestra feel, alive. All right, now let's go in and let's add in our brass section. Number 3 is going to be our modal harmony. So here's one of Shore's biggest secrets. Middle Earth, doesn't sound ancient because of the instruments. It really sounds ancient because of the harmony. Most modern music relies heavily on like major and minor tonal systems, but Shore often kind of blends like traditional harmony with modal writing. So my cue, this one is centered around D minor, but it's not purely minor. If you notice the chord changes up at the top, throughout the piece, there are hints of modal color that keep the harmony feeling old and timeless. Let's look at the progression. We've got D minor, G minor, A minor, F major, C major, and B flat major. What makes this progression special is really the B flat and C chords. So that flat, 6, and 7, those chords appear constantly throughout Shore's writing. So what he's really doing here is it kind of creates a feeling that's both noble and melancholy and kind of ancient all at the same time. So this is one of, those Middle Earth kind of defining sounds. One of the things too is notice how rarely we're using the dominant 7th chord here. And the idea is that, when this does finally arrive and land, it means something. It feels important once we get there. And this is one of the first things that I really noticed when I was kind of starting to study Howard Shore's work is that he uses that, strong harmonic resolution pretty sparingly. When he finally does give you that dominant chord that resolves, it really, really hits home and drives the power forward. All right, now let's talk about storytelling, because this is where Shore separates himself from a lot of film composers. Themes don't typically just kind of stay frozen with him. They evolve, even if a reoccurring motif kind of comes back in. So let's check out the second half of this cue where we start back on our D minor chord here again and watching our horn melody. All right, if you notice our opening theme right here kind of returns, but the harmony underneath it has changed. The emotional context has also changed, and suddenly the same musical material kind of feels different. So when we hit this E minor 7 flat 5 chord, it's basically a half diminished chord. It's unstable, it's uncertain, and it kind of feels like, something dangerous is approaching. So right here we've got G minor. We resolve to our A7 chord finally. Shore uses this type of tension constantly during moments of tension, not because it's complicated, but because it creates, emotional ambiguity. The audience feels something, wrong before they really kind of understand why. and that instability resolves into our dominant chord. So finally we hit that, A7 chord, and again it really means something. We're home. It's the same theme underneath with the horns, but it has a different meaning. So that's the transformation that I'm talking about, and that's that type of storytelling that, again, with even something as simple as the same theme but with a different chord with a lot of tension that finally resolves home, you're able to keep that consistency of the theme, but the chords are now kind of telling that story and coloring basically a different emotion during that part. So let's jump back into the session and actually see how kind of everything breaks down and works. So if I mute the brass, I mean, it sounds fine, but it's not particularly epic in any way. All right, now let's build the world around it. So our strings provide the emotional weight. Our woodwinds provide the atmosphere and that movement. Our low brass provides basically the gravity of the score. And now with the full orchestra. And now it feels cinematic. What's interesting about this is with this kind of writing, a lot of times the melody is not going to change a lot, but the atmosphere and everything that's built around it really is what changes. And that's that type of storytelling that I love that Howard Shore does. So if you go back and watch Lord of the Rings, really listen to how many times you hear the melody, but how often the chord change and the accompaniment changes around it, and the type of instrumentation choice that he chooses to use each time you hear that theme come back in. Epic music isn't about stacking more instruments. It's really about giving each instrument a purpose. Every section should really kind of contribute to that story. So, if this is something you want to experiment with this approach, don't start with the full score. Really start with like a culture. Imagine a fictional kingdom or a fantasy race, a civilization, game that you're working on. Write a simple theme, 4 or 5 notes. That's it. Ask yourself what instruments belong to those people. What is the harmonic language that really belongs to them? Would the theme change if they won the battle or the race or whatever it is? What would happen if they lost? So could you take that same theme and weave a different narrative or a different harmony and set of textures around it? So that's the exact thought process that Shore used throughout that whole kind of Middle Earth theme. And he wrote, a different theme for every culture, and every culture had its own theme and kind of identity. Every time you would hear that theme come in, he didn't do it exactly the same way. And that's really the genius here. Howard Shore didn't create one of the greatest, film scores ever written because he had better melodies than anybody else. He created it because every musical choice really served that story or that world. The harmony, the orchestration, the transformations, everything worked together to make Middle Earth feel real. And that's the lesson that I really wanted to demonstrate with this cue. So if you enjoyed that, hit the subscribe button, and I will see you in the next one.